1. The House of Shadows. The legend of the House of Shadows had haunted the small town for generations. On the outskirts, hidden behind thick trees and shrouded in mist, stood a mansion that no one dared approach. Locals whispered that it was cursed, a place where the souls of the dead lingered, unable to move on. The once grand house had long been abandoned, its windows boarded up, its doors rusted shut. But as every Halloween approached, the house seemed to pulse with a strange, dark energy. 5 friends, Charlie, Sarah, Tim, Lucy, and Ben, decided to challenge the town's terrifying legend. They had grown tired of the ghost stories and wanted to experience the thrill of the house firsthand. Halloween night was the perfect occasion for their daring adventure. As they approached the house, the cold wind carried a faint sound, like a whisper in the night. "Don't go," it seemed to warn them. Ignoring the chills creeping down their spines, the group stepped onto the porch and knocked on the decaying wooden door. It creaked open slowly, revealing the darkness within. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. They turned on their flashlights, casting weak beams of light that barely illuminated the surroundings. The interior was covered in cobwebs, old furniture left untouched, and the silence hung heavy. As they ventured deeper into the house, the temperature dropped drastically. Tim, always the brave one, moved ahead and pushed open a door that led to a dark hallway. "Come on," he called back, "there's something cool down here." But as the others followed, something strange happened. The house seemed to shift. The walls closed in around them, the rooms becoming maze-like. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the air became heavy, stifling. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered. "We should leave." But before they could react, they heard a sound, a scraping noise like nails dragging across stone. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a tall, gaunt woman, her face obscured by dark, matted hair. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. The air around them grew thick with terror. The shadows seemed to dance and warp, forming into terrifying shapes that whispered their darkest fears. The friends tried to escape, but every exit they found led them back to the same hallway. As the figure moved toward them, Ben screamed in terror, trying to push past the woman. But she grabbed his arm, her grip like ice. His screams were cut short as he was dragged into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. The group was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the figure advanced. They tried to run in separate directions, but the house seemed to shift and close around them. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and the shadows seemed to chase them. Suddenly, they found themselves back in the same room where they had started. The walls were now alive with movement, the shadows swirling and whispering. And then they saw it. The same woman standing in the corner, her mouth open wide in a silent scream. But this time, there was no escape. The house had claimed them, and every Halloween, they would be part of the legend, trapped in the House of Shadows for eternity. 2. The Witch of Wraith Hollow. The village of Wraith Hollow was small and unassuming, a quiet place nestled deep in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. Every year, the villagers celebrated the harvest season with a grand festival. But there was something darker about this town, something the outsiders didn't know. For generations, the villagers had followed a chilling tradition. On Halloween night, they would gather to honor the spirit of Selene, a powerful witch who once ruled the village with fear and cruelty. The townspeople made offerings to her grave in the hopes of securing a prosperous harvest for the year. They believed that if they didn't keep the witch appeased, terrible things would happen. Emma, a curious and brave 16-year-old, had heard stories about the witch but never took them seriously. She lived in a nearby town, but when her friends invited her to spend Halloween in Wraith Hollow, she was excited to experience something different. The moment she arrived, the village seemed strange, silent and watchful, the air thick with tension. "Why does everyone seem so on edge?" Emma asked her friend Clara, who had grown up in Wraith Hollow. Clara's face was pale, and she looked around nervously. "You'll see tonight. We have to keep the tradition, or else what?" Emma interrupted, laughing off her friend's warning. That night, after the festival's festivities had ended, the villagers gathered around the old stone church. The air was cold, and the ground was slick with dew. Emma, Clara, and the others followed the villagers through the narrow streets to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. There, at the center, stood an ancient tomb, its surface covered with strange runes and symbols. Tonight, we honor Celine, the town elder, a frail old man, said as he raised his arms toward the heavens. And we offer our tribute. Emma watched in confusion as the townspeople began chanting in an ancient tongue surrounding the tomb. What's happening? Emma asked Clara, her heart racing. Clara turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. We have to leave. Now. Before Emma could react, the ground beneath them shook violently. The tombstone cracked, and from within, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and pale, with wild, dark hair and a twisted grin on her face. She was the witch Celine, risen from the dead. Foolish children, Celine hissed. You disturb my rest. The villagers fell to their knees, offering up their sacrifices. One by one, they were dragged into the earth, consumed by the witch's dark magic. Emma and Clara turned to flee, but Celine's gaze locked onto Emma. With a flick of her wrist, Emma was thrown to the ground, her body paralyzed. You will serve me now, Celine whispered. Forever. As the witch's cold fingers brushed Emma's face, her vision blurred, and she could hear the screams of those around her. The witch's power overwhelmed her senses, and Emma felt herself slipping into darkness. The villagers, their faces twisted in terror, were now part of Celine's army, bound to serve her for all eternity. Emma screamed, but there was no escape. 3. The Harvest of Souls. In a quiet rural town, known for its autumn harvest festival, a dark and terrible secret was kept from outsiders. The villagers celebrated the harvest each year with a grand feast. But the feast was not just for food, it was for something much darker. Each year, one soul was sacrificed to ensure the village's prosperity. The townspeople offered the life of one of their own to the spirits of the harvest, ensuring bountiful crops and good fortune. No one ever questioned it, for it had been a tradition for as long as anyone could remember. One year, a young couple, Alex and Lily, decided to visit the town on Halloween. The village seemed quaint and peaceful, a perfect place to enjoy the season. But as they wandered through the streets, they began to notice that the townspeople seemed a bit too content. Everyone was friendly, but their smiles seemed forced, like they were hiding something. As night fell, Alex and Lily joined the villagers at the town square for the grand feast. The aroma of roasted meats and sweet pies filled the air, and the villagers cheered as the harvest was celebrated. But as the evening wore on, Alex began to feel uneasy. There was something off about the way the villagers were acting, like they were waiting for something or someone. And then it happened. The mayor, an elderly man with a wide grin, stood before the crowd. Tonight we celebrate the harvest, and we offer our gift to the spirits, he announced. A hush fell over the crowd, and Alex and Lily watched in horror as a young man, no older than them, was brought forward. His eyes were wide with terror as the townspeople began chanting. Alex's heart raced as the man was tied to a wooden stake in the center of the square. Lily whispered, "What are they doing?" But Alex didn't have time to answer. The villagers began to circle the stake, chanting louder, their eyes glazed with madness. Then, with a flick of the mayor's hand, the man was set ablaze. Screams filled the air as the flames consumed the young man. But as the fire burned, the ground trembled, and the harvest came alive. From the smoke and fire, dark figures emerged, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The spirits of the harvest had been appeased, and now they were hungry for more. Alex and Lily tried to run, but the village had become a prison. The spirits of the harvest were everywhere, claiming anyone who tried to escape. The town's tradition had cost them everything. 1. The haunted reflection. Every Halloween, the Miller family would visit their old, creaky family estate just outside town. It had been passed down through generations, and every member of the family had fond memories of spending time there. But something had always been a bit strange about the house, something that no one had ever spoken about. This Halloween, however, the youngest of the family, Sophie, would discover the house's most sinister secret. Sophie had always been curious. While the adults were busy with preparations for the harvest festival, she often wandered the house, exploring its many rooms and forgotten corners. But there was one room she'd always avoided, the old family mirror room. The mirror room was a place where generations of millers would gather for important ceremonies. It was a grand, glass-lined room, where every surface was covered in elaborate mirrors of all sizes. Some mirrors were ancient, passed down from their ancestors, while others had been collected from distant lands. The room's purpose was to reflect the family's legacy. Yet it was also a place that had grown ominous over the years. Sophie often heard strange sounds emanating from the room, faint whispers as if the mirrors themselves were speaking. On Halloween night, after everyone else had retired for bed, Sophie could no longer resist the pull of the mirror room. She crept down the hallway, her footsteps muffled on the old wooden floor, and gently pushed open the door. The room was as eerie as she remembered, the mirrors reflecting her every movement. As she stepped inside, Sophie noticed that one mirror, in particular, caught her eye. It was slightly larger than the rest, framed in dark wood that looked older than the house itself. Curious, Sophie stood in front of the mirror. For a few moments, she simply admired her reflection. But then, something began to shift. Her image in the mirror seemed to blur, her features becoming distorted as if something were pulling at her. Sophie's heart began to race. Suddenly, the reflection of Sophie in the mirror began to smile. Wide, unnaturally wide, as if the smile stretched beyond human limits. And then, the reflection in the mirror moved. Sophie's reflection stepped out of the glass and stood behind her. Frozen with terror, Sophie turned to face the reflection. But it wasn't her. It was something else, something dark and twisted. The reflection grinned at her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. Sophie screamed, but the creature in the mirror reached out with long, bony fingers and touched her shoulder. The contact was icy cold, and in an instant, Sophie felt herself being pulled into the mirror. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped in the reflection, her body frozen in place, while the dark entity in the mirror took her place in the real world. The next morning, Sophie's family found her standing in front of the mirror, motionless, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth locked in a silent scream. But when they tried to pull her away from the glass, it was as if she had become part of it. The mirrors never stopped reflecting her, but the real Sophie was gone, replaced by something far darker. Now, every Halloween, when the family gathers in the estate, they feel Sophie's cold presence in the mirror room, and the reflection that smiles at them is never quite their own. 2. The Midnight Harvest. In the small town of Old Hollow, Halloween wasn't just a celebration, it was a ritual. The villagers had lived under the rule of an ancient curse for centuries, one that they dared not speak of in the light of day. Every year, when the harvest was gathered, the townsfolk offered a sacrifice to the ancient spirits that protected the land. The sacrifice had to be fresh, someone with a pure heart, and they had to be given willingly. If they weren't, the town would wither and die, its crops failing and its children suffering. The villagers had learned this the hard way, and now they followed the tradition without question. This Halloween, however, things would go terribly wrong. Megan had always loved Halloween. It was her favorite time of year, filled with pumpkins, bonfires, and spooky stories. But when she moved to Old Hollow with her family, she quickly noticed that the town's enthusiasm for the season seemed unnaturally intense. Everywhere she went, the townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the harvest festival, as if the celebration was the most important event of their lives. It wasn't until the night of the festival that Megan learned the true reason behind their obsession. The festival began like any other, with the townspeople dancing around a giant bonfire in the center of the square. Laughter filled the air, and there was an unmistakable sense of joy. But when midnight struck, the mood changed. The music stopped, and the air grew thick with an eerie silence. Megan and her friends were ushered into the center of the square, where the mayor, a tall, thin man with a gaunt face, stood holding a ceremonial knife. In front of him was a small stone altar, covered with symbols that Megan didn't recognize. Tonight, the mayor announced, "We honor the spirits who protect this town. Tonight, we give thanks for the harvest, and we offer the blood of the innocent to keep our town safe for another year." Before Megan could react, she was pulled toward the altar by two strong hands. Her friends tried to intervene, but they were held back by the crowd, who now looked at her with cold, empty eyes. They were all part of the ritual, their faces pale with the knowledge of what would come. "No! What are you doing?" Megan cried, but her voice was drowned out by the chanting of the villagers. The mayor raised the knife high, and just as he was about to strike, Megan felt a sudden surge of power. The ground beneath her trembled, and the harvest crops around the square began to twist and writhe like living creatures. The pumpkins rolled toward the altar, their jagged faces twisting into grotesque smiles. The corn stalks swayed unnaturally, their leaves rustling like the whispers of the dead. The sky above the town turned blood red, and the spirits of the harvest, the ancient beings that had once been worshipped, began to rise from the earth. Their skeletal hands reached out from the soil, pulling the villagers into the ground. The very air was filled with their wailing cries, and the earth seemed to come alive with a terrifying hunger. Megan, realizing that the sacrifice wasn't just a tradition, it was a call to the spirits, a ritual to summon something far worse, broke free from the grasp of her captors. With one last desperate scream, she ran from the square, but the spirits were already closing in. The next day, Old Hollow was gone. The harvest had been claimed, but not in the way anyone had expected. The ground had opened up, swallowing the town whole. All that remained was a field of twisted crops and a single, blood-red moon hanging in the sky. And as the winds howled through the barren land, the spirits of the harvest whispered of the price that had been paid and the ones who would come next.